Hi, welcome along to another Gary's Theology. Today, looking at John chapter 9, which is a pretty long chunk of Bible reading, but it's all one story. So we're going to sort of touch on as much as possible, but doubtless we'll miss stuff out, whilst at the same time painting these up to hopefully look somewhat like a whale. Just some water from my brush. So, long reading, because we're on the lectionary and the run up to Easter, and it's long because John in chapter 9 sticks with like a healing story all the way through. So not just like the act of the healing, but also the sort of what happens afterwards of the healing. And so it takes longer to go through because you're doing more of it. But it does mean that you sort of see the working out, the consequences of Jesus's healing. So you get slightly more idea of what is going on in Jesus's choice to heal. So that's what we're going to do. Start off with the whale being blue, because that just seems appropriate. So let's see. So the story starts with Jesus and the disciples out and encountering a man who's been blind since birth. I'm being rough with this because I've got it all masked up, so might as well be enjoying the freedom of masking. And as they walk along, they meet a man born blind, and the disciples are under a common conception of the age that this man being blind must be a result of sin. Essentially, they'd never read the book of Job. I mean, I'm sure they had, but somehow it hadn't stuck. And so they saw blindness as sinfulness. And they're wrong, and Jesus goes on to tell them that they're wrong. And in doing so, he then picks up on their sort of over-exaggerated understanding of that metaphor of blindness being sinfulness. And sort of uses that error to teach them something really important about who he is, which is nice. So the disciples have a metaphorical understanding of blindness is sinfulness, darkness is bad, day is good, night is bad, sight is good, blindness is bad. That's how they see the world. And Jesus picks up that metaphor and runs with it through the rest of this story. And so in trying to run with this, he then speaks of himself. He says, I am the light of the world. And he heals the man, where he makes clay with his spit on the ground and puts it on the man's face and sends him off. The man sent by the Father sends someone to the well of scent to get his eyes washed. And in all this sending, we see Jesus says, I am the light of the world, and then demonstrates the truth of that statement through what happens next. So, I am the light of the world is quite a bold statement. It's saying, I am the source of truth, I am the source of authority. If you want to know the real truth, listen to me. So it needs, rationally, it needs a little defense to it. Can't go around claiming to be something that you're not. And so Jesus defends his claim of being the light of the world by allowing someone who's never been able to see, or not allowing, by giving the person who's never been able to see the ability to see. To my mind, it seems quite possible that this man had literally got no eyes. It's quite possible, just no eyes, but definitely no functioning eyes. And so in this moment, Jesus is creating in the man functioning eyes. which to me seems fairly incredible. And that's his way of establishing the truth that he is the light of the world. So why do I believe that Jesus is the light of the world? Because he brings sight and understanding where there was no sight. And I realise that it's a not exactly politically correct way of thinking about disability, and for that, just acknowledge that it's Jesus who did it, not me. So I am the light of the world, says Jesus. I am the one you need to come to for an understanding of what is going on. And so he gives the guy sight, and the guy goes home, he goes to the well of scent, and as he's told, comes back home seeing. And he's so changed that people don't recognise him, which I think is quite impressive. You know, his neighbours, people who've known him his whole life, don't recognise him as being the person they've known. You know, he's too, you know, I think it's quite understandable that you don't recognise him, really, because he spent his whole life not being able to see. That's what's really defined him to them, is, oh, that's Bob, he can't see. And now suddenly he can see. You can see why they would be, that can't really be Bob, it must be Bob's evil twin. Because Bob definitely can't see. And so why can't they recognise him? Because it's impossible. It must be someone else pretending to be Bob, even if he looks just like Bob, it can't be Bob. So what do? Well, he insists that he is Bob, and so they do the only thing they can do. They go into the Pharisees because there's a God thing has happened, so they go to the guys who are all about God. They go to the Pharisees to get the truth of it established. And he goes to the Pharisees, and the Pharisees already know they don't like Jesus. We know from later, because they say, anyone who says Jesus is the Messiah, is to be thrown out. So they don't like Jesus. And then this man says, Jesus did it, and not only did he do it, he did it on the Sabbath, and he did it making clay with his spit. And so he's broken their understanding of what Sabbath means. They're wrong, they're putting on their own ideas, but whichever way they've done it, they believe Jesus is wrong, and so they're upset with Jesus. And as a result of this, they have to choose. Either they accept that the person who's just created sight in this man who was born blind is of God, and they're wrong about the Sabbath, or that they're right about the Sabbath, and this man who's just created sight in this man who's born blind, then this apparently very good thing that man really wanted to happen is actually a bad guy and doing it through some other means. And so that seems unlikely. So they went, well, maybe this guy's just lying. It's a charlatan trick. I mean, if I came to you and said, I heard the story of a man who couldn't see for his whole life, born blind, and now suddenly he can see, he's got eyesight, you'd probably be a little bit sceptical. And so they go, right, let's get this guy's parents in. And so they bring the guy's parents in, and this is the turning point of the whole story. John writes the story, so it turns around this point where the parents are seeing the Pharisees, and the Pharisees are trying to get them to perjure themselves because they want a false witness. We know that's how the Pharisees work, because that's what they do in Jesus' trial later. And they're like, is this your son? Was he born blind? And how did it happen? And the subtext, if you tell us that it was Jesus who did it, we're going to throw you out of the synagogue, so you probably ought to answer that question with a different answer. So they say, we know this is our son. We know he was born blind. In this point, they're saying there's definitely a miracle that happened. We're two independent witnesses of age, and we're saying a miracle has happened. But we're not going to answer the question of how it happened, because we don't want to be thrown out of the synagogue, and we also don't want to lie. And so now the Pharisees are in even more trouble, because a miracle has definitely happened, and they definitely don't want to get into the point of having to concede that Jesus did it. And so they're like, right, bring the blind man back, or the man once blind back. Let's have another question. Let's see if we can get the truth out of him. And so they bring him back, and they say, give glory to God and tell the truth. Spiritual abuse, if you didn't know what it looked like, that's what it looks like. And the man's like, I don't know anything about Jesus. All I know is I was blind and now I can see. And the simple answer, the simple truth, really upsets them. They start hurling insults at him, and he's like, you don't know anything about him, and yet you're saying he's a bad guy. Well, we know that God only ministers through... He don't listen to bad people. He listens to good people, and a good thing has happened to me, so why do you so convinced he's a bad guy? And again, they're incensed. There are biblical ways that they can test his relatively straightforward, simple, experiential argument, but they don't take it because they're just so enraged that this man, born steeped in sin, born blind, could lecture them, and so they throw him out. And Jesus comes to them, or Jesus hears the man's been thrown out of the synagogue, thrown out of this place of worship, and so he seeks him out. Hardly ever does Jesus seek people out in the Gospels, but he seeks this man out, and he reveals himself to him. For the first time, the man born blind can see Jesus, and Jesus says, do you trust? And the man says, I want to worship him, and Jesus says, it's me, and the man worships him. And then Jesus begins to explain the theology of what's happened, how because he wanted to see, God gave him sight, and people who want to know the truth, he will open himself up to and bring the truth. But anyone who thinks that they can already see, anyone who thinks their righteous ways, their good deeds will bring righteousness, well, they're just bringing judgment on themselves. And the Pharisees overhear this conversation, like, what, you're saying we're blind? And Jesus is like, well, do you think you can see? Like, of course we can see. Well, then you will be judged as people who can see. It's basically saying, if you think you can earn your way into heaven, then good luck to you. Off you pop. Do your best. But ultimately, you will find that you're wrong and you will be held accountable for your choices. Whereas those who think, no, I am not a good person, I need Jesus' help, will be given sight, life by him, in the same way the man born blind was given sight and could see. So it's a long story. There's a lot more detail. There are a lot of other things we go into. You could probably spend an entire year just going through the details of this passage. But to me, the important thing is that you are showing three clear ways of choosing. Either you just think Jesus is not the light of the world, in which case you're like one of the Pharisees and good luck to you, off you go. Or you are like, or I am like the parents. I think Jesus has done a good thing. I think he probably has restored light, but I am not so committed to Jesus that I'm willing to suffer a loss of reputation or respect in order to stand up for Jesus. Or you are like the son. You realise that you once were blind and now you see, and there is nothing you can do but tell people that Jesus gave you sight. Three choices. I think we're going to live more and more in a world where being like the parents is going to be the preferable choice. Not saying what Jesus has done, not saying what Jesus taught is going to be the way of getting through life without any problems, without getting thrown out. But I think we need to be confident that Jesus will come and find us. When we witness for him, he will come and find us. When we stand for him, he will stand with us. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for the faithfulness of this man born blind who came to you and found sight. Lord, help us all to come to you and know sight. Amen. Thanks for joining me, and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.